From the JAMA Network, this is JAMA Surgery Author Interviews. Conversations with authors exploring the latest clinical research, reviews, and opinions featured in JAMA Surgery.
Welcome, JAMA Surgery listeners. This is Amalia Cochran, the web and social media editor for JAMA Surgery, and today I'm talking about single-port robotic-assisted nipple-sparing mastectomy with Dr. Deborah Farr and Dr. Herbert from the University of Texas Southwestern in Dallas. Thank you both for your time today.
Thank you for having us.
Pleasure to be here.
I thought the idea of using single-port robotic surgery for nipple-sparing mastectomies was tremendously innovative when I read your manuscript. And I also noticed that apparently I wasn't the only one that thought it was innovative, because I saw that it was approved by the FDA under an investigational device exemption. And as a reader who is somewhat naive to product and device approvals and those processes, please walk me through why that IDE was required and what that process looked like.
Absolutely. We were really fortunate to have a sim center with a robot available. At the time, I was very involved in surgical education and was exposed to the robot and approached Dr. Zay about doing robotic nipple-sparing mastectomies. And at that time, I was done with the XI robot, which is the multi-arm robot. Dr. Zay sent myself and the plastic surgeon that I work with, Dr. Nicholas Haddock, to Italy to see if it was feasible, basically. And we figured out it absolutely is. But when we tried to replicate the surgery that they did in Italy back in the States in the sim center with cadaveric models, we realized why it was potentially dangerous. In 2019, the FDA put out a statement saying that the robotic mastectomy should be approached with caution and with advisement, basically, from an IRB or a research standpoint, just because of the nature of the procedure. There can be complications where the robot could, potentially enter the chest or cause other damage that, if it wasn't properly supervised, could be pretty irresponsible. When we came back and started doing the surgery with the XI and the cadaveric models, we realized they made that statement because it's a powerful robot and it isn't really designed for a small space. And when we tried to replicate that surgery, we realized that it took a lot of finagling to make the arms not collide on the outside of the body. And that's a lot to pay attention to when you try to focus on the surgery inside the body. So at that time, we knew that the SP was available, and Dr. Zay suggested that we use the SP instead of the XI. So what we did was there was only one SP available, so we did the same cadaveric model practice surgery with the SP in the hospital, which took a lot of paperwork to figure out. And we realized that it was much more apt. It was a much better robot for the surgery that we were trying to do. So since that surgery hadn't been performed in the United States, we had to approach the FDA to see if we could get this investigational device exemption for the SP robot.
Fascinating. That was a lot of work. Dr. Farr, I was also interested in the enrollment process for your patients, and particularly with this having been done under an IDE, were there questions or concerns that you found patients and families raising during that process?
Yes, there have always been questions about, how many have you done? What were the other outcomes? But mostly, I think that people are very interested and have approached us more than we have approached them in terms of if they're a candidate for the surgery, mostly because of the outcomes that we've found as we've done more and more of these surgeries.
I'm also really curious about the technical aspects of these cases, and specifically that idea of transferring the single port technology to this particular operation. And I know, Dr. Zay, that's where you played a major role because of your own knowledge of working with the single port robot. Were there any particular challenges for doing single port mastectomies that you identified as you all were troubleshooting this project with the cadaveric efforts that you had to resolve?
I think the first aha moment was just as Dr. Farr outlined, which is that the multi-port robot, which I have a lot of experience with, having done, since 2008, now over 1,500 robotic pancreas resections. It was clear that the multi-port robot XI platform was not going to work. The number of conflicts at the bedside, and I actually agreed that it was a safety issue that we were going to run into. I think the biggest hurdle for the SP was just getting access to the machine, because the only machine that we have was one that was already being clinically used by our urologists and our ENT doctors, whereas we have a fully functional XI in the sim center that we could use. So that really was the hardest part. But once we were able to get through the regulatory hurdle of having a cadaver in the OR, we were able, I think, to pretty quickly work out the logistics of how we would position the patient, how we would position the arm. And then, as we started into the cases, Dr. Farr took it in a stepwise approach. Initially, the anterior flap was done in the traditional way, and we just focused on taking the breast tissue off of the chest wall. And then as more experience was gained, we realized that the entire thing could be done that way. And now I think Dr. Farr is one of the first, honestly, in the world who's doing the entire thing, both the flap and the chest wall with the robot. And there's some real advantages. I'll let her speak to that.
I actually would like to hear a little bit more about what you as a surgeon are perceiving as the advantages of using this technology in this way.
Yeah, I think originally when the idea of the robotic mastectomy originated, I thought that the biggest advantage would be visualization because the nipple-sparing mastectomy, the traditional way where you make the incision in the inframammary fold and you use a retractor to visualize the rest of the breast, really the only person that can see anything is the operating surgeon. So it's very difficult to teach. And you know that at the beginning of my career, the main thing I was focusing on was surgical education and teaching. So I thought, if you stick a camera in there and arms, you can use both of them, not just one to retract and one to operate. It could have a lot of advantages with visualization, better removal of the tissue, actually making sure that you get the fascia off the pec. I thought there were a lot of advantages. Now that I'm into it a little bit more and have seen several of these surgeries and done these surgeries since I think it's coming up on 4 years now, yes, there's a huge advantage to visualization. I think that there's a really big advantage to having a video of the entire surgery so that you can know, not just believe from an operative note, that you removed all the tissue. Because you can see how thin the skin flap is. You can actually see the little robotic arm sometimes like through the flap because of the light. And seeing is believing. So, once you see several of these cases, you can see that you're doing a surgery that is not only easier for me, I'm not sore after the surgery where you're in different positions trying to remove this tissue, but you can effectively remove all this tissue. You can explain what you're doing to the other people in the room, people who potentially come to visit and observe. But then also post-operatively, they have a smaller incision. And one of the big things that we found in our study was that they have much more retained sensation than they do in the traditional open surgery, which was kind of the big surprise for us, was how much sensation they maintained. And really, when that became something that was reproducible and has been something that our patients have been super excited about and have been very active on social media saying, like, I had the surgery, I can feel everything, then that's when people started to come to us and asking if they were a candidate for this surgery. And that's, I think, the biggest surprise for us and probably the biggest pleasure is that we're doing something that not only makes the surgery easier for us, but has a better outcome for the patient.
Is there anything that you would have done differently in designing your initial series now that you know what you know? What have been your lessons learned in this process?
Yeah, I would have gotten sensation testing before the surgery. The first several patients, I think for the first year and a half, we didn't do preoperative sensation testing. So we weren't able to tell, how much sensation they had after the surgery versus before the surgery. So yeah, I would have probably implemented that when we started doing this. But now we're far enough along into it that we have really good data before and after in the patients that we've done in the last 2 years. It's still the same, it's maintained.
Well, and I think it was great to see how, as you got into the series and you sort of realized that there might be something there, that you adapted your protocols that you were using to try and confirm your bias that you were developing, I guess, and actually have data to back it up.
Exactly.
Dr. Say, is there anything that you think could have or should have been done slightly differently in terms of how you all initiated this process? It seems like it was incredibly thoughtful, but I'm always curious to see if there's something that you've learned along the way.
Yeah, I think honestly, I'm very pleased with how this has unfolded, and especially doing it under an IDE. I fully appreciate the skeptics and those who are cautious about the oncologic long-term outcomes. But coming from Pittsburgh and knowing Bernie Fisher personally for many years, I can tell you they thought the same thing about him when he proposed lumpectomy. That I think they took him up in front of Congress because people were so outraged that he would be harming women. And so this is the natural evolution of breast surgery to continue to make it more and more comfortable for the woman, the outcome's better. And what we've learned is as we've de-intensified, we haven't harmed oncologic outcomes. I think the onus is on us to prove that under a formal study. But I think that the knee-jerk response that lesser surgery or done through a minimally invasive approach is necessarily going to be less oncologic just doesn't fit with history.
That leads logically to another question that I had, which was, certainly you've got great immediate and short-term outcome data for the operation at this point. What concerns or questions might you have about longer-term outcomes or longer-term data for your patients?
I think the main thing is that we're still trying to fit in with the standard of care in terms of recurrence. So for a patient who has a traditional mastectomy, the recurrence for an in-breast cancer, in other words, for cancer on the chest wall, is about 2 to 5%. Those are national numbers. And so we're following these patients every 6 months. They come in for an exam. They have any sort of lump, bump, or symptom or whatnot. It's thoroughly investigated. And like I said, we've been doing this for almost 4 years and we haven't seen any recurrences. Also, the cancer, when we operate on women who have cancer, it's all treated within the standard of care. People who need an axillary dissection, they get it. They need chemotherapy, radiation, everything is done within the standard of care. Really, the only thing that is different is that the tool that we use to do the mastectomy happens to be a robot, but everything else is the same.
Since we talked about the fact that this had to be done under the IDE, the investigational device exemption, what does the process look like to get the IDE lifted so that you can more easily move forward with broader prospective studies?
Yeah, everybody asks me how long I'm going to have this IDE in place. And to me, the IDE is an opportunity. It really isn't a restriction. It's the opportunity to have the resources and the supervision really to make everybody understand that this is not something that we're trying to get away with or do something that's incorrect. It's an opportunity to really very closely monitor what we're doing. I think that in the future, what will eventually happen is the Da Vinci robotic company will perform a trial where they will apply for an IDE to have the robot FDA approved. And if that ever happens in the future, then my IDE will become unnecessary.
I think that's an important distinction. We're clinical investigators and clinically initiated investigation. And so our intent with this IDE is not to apply to the FDA for a change in indications. That's up to the company. Our job with the IDE is to make sure we're tracking the outcomes and we're doing it in a systematic, formal way that is acceptable to the community.
Which you are absolutely doing.
I think that eventually what I would love to do is I would love to develop an educational system so that women could have this surgery by other physicians around the country and, they could be taught properly how to do this effectively and reproducibly. I was going to say the cool thing about doing this by myself is that as we learn more about the surgery and how it can be easier, I do not have to really discuss with anybody else about changing the protocol. I can, change this protocol based on my own judgment and do the surgery, in the best way that I think possible. And Dr. Zay touched on that a little bit. We were able to go to Korea and observe how the surgeons out there do the flaps of the mastectomy with the robot, which is something that we hadn't done previously. And after seeing how they do it, we were able to apply it to our surgery, change the protocol, and then advance the surgery that way. So that's kind of the fun thing about doing it just myself. But eventually, I think that we'll iron out all the kinks and we'll be able to teach other surgeons. And I would love to see this be something that's a lot more commonplace.
I really like your approach to that. Dr. Farr and Dr. Zay, thank you both so much for taking the time to talk to me today.
Thank you so much for having us.
My pleasure. Thank you for your time.
This episode was produced by Daniel Musisi at the JAMA Network. To follow this and other JAMA Network podcasts, please visit us online at jamanetworkaudio.com. Thanks for listening.